Okay, this video will focus on how to include a they-say position in your introductions, which will help you stress how your argument differs from others. So for this video, make sure you've read the introduction in chapter 1 of They Say, I Say, and if you need to, go back and review the principles of introductions that I discussed in the previous video. So as you will have learned from the reading, one of the key moves in academic writing is to emphasize how your argument, your thesis, differs from the position of somebody else. How your I say differs from their they say. This is important because 1, it explains the relevance of your argument for your reader, and 2, it is more realistic since we only ever really argue with someone if we are first provoked, and 3, most importantly, it helps us become more sophisticated and critical thinkers. So you will have also learned from your reading that generally it is better to begin your argument by first explaining the they say position so that it will be more clear how your argument is different from that. Because of that, you'll generally want to explain the they say position in your introduction. All right. Now, there are a few different ways of doing that, and I'm going to suggest a couple that I recommend you apply to your own writing. So if you recall from the video on introductions, an introduction generally has 3 components: a baseline, a pivot, and a solution. The baseline is where you establish some common ground with your reader. You start with familiar, accessible, generally accepted position. The pivot is where you pose a problem or question that disrupts that stable, familiar position. Then the solution is where you provide your solution, your thesis, or explanation, your argument that resolves that problem or question. Okay, now within this structure, there are 2 primary places where you might introduce a they-say position. The first would be in the baseline. Here you would make the position you are arguing with the familiar, common ground position that you are then going to challenge, question, or disrupt with your pivot. I would say that this is probably the most common approach to introducing a they-say position in your introduction. All right. So take, for example, the essay Hidden Intellectualism by Gerald Graff, which is found in the back of your They Say, I Say book. Graff begins with, quote, "Everyone knows some young person who is impressively street smart but does poorly in school. What a waste, we think, that one who is so intelligent about so many things in life seems unable to apply that intelligence to academic work." Then Graff disrupts that position in his next sentence, his pivot. What doesn't occur to us, though, is that schools and colleges might be at fault for missing the opportunity to tap into such street smarts and channel them into good academic work. He will go on to argue in the next paragraph that schools and colleges shouldn't overlook how intellectual concerns can apply as much to cars, dating, and sports as, say, Plato, Shakespeare, and nuclear fission. But he first arrived at that argument by starting with a general, non-specific they-say position, that everyone knows who is street smart and that we consider it a waste, right? Now that is an example of how to start with a generic they-say, but the same principle applies if you want to respond to a specific source. Okay? Take, for example, this post from the personal finance blog, The Simple Dollar. The author, Trent Ham, begins by describing himself flipping through the book The Cheapskate Next Door at the library. Then he briefly summarizes the book's argument that choosing to live below your means should be grounded in your higher values and beliefs. The following paragraph expounds on how his own life connects with that book's argument, but then the author pivots with, "But that's far from the only reason." All right? So you'll notice that the author begins by summarizing and quoting the they-say position, which provides the baseline from which he will pivot and develop his own unique I say. Okay, so to recap, one way to introduce the they-say position into your introductions is to incorporate it into your baseline, whether you are summarizing a generic position, what everyone says, to go back to Graff's example, or whether you are summarizing a specific argument that you are going to respond to. Usually you will introduce your they-say position here in the baseline if you want to raise a problem or question that the they-say position either is unaware of or hasn't taken into consideration, if it's part of a common perspective that you want to challenge in your pivot. Okay. The other method is to incorporate the they-say position into the part of the introduction after the baseline and the pivot, the part that explains what your solution or thesis will be. You would want to introduce the they-say position here if the they-say position you are responding to already agrees that the problem or question you raised in your pivot needs to be addressed, but that you have different solutions or answers to that problem or question. Okay? So take, for instance, this op-ed written by Peter Lerner. which argues that President Obama is at fault for the Democratic Party's electoral losses in 2016. So the author spends a number of paragraphs explaining how bright the future looked for Democrats after his victory in 2008, and then pivots to say that now, in 2017, things look really bad for them, ending his pivot by asking, what happened? He then outlines different possible answers to that question, different they-say positions people have raised. Okay. Quote, for some of the president's admirers, the answer is that America has become benighted and bigoted. For others, the culprit is the Republican Party, which obstructed Mr. Obama at every turn. And for still others, like Mr. Obama, the problem is that his administration didn't do enough to advertise its greatness. But the author goes on to reject these positions and then introduces his own I say position, which is that, quote, the decimation of the Democratic Party came because Mr. Obama turned out to be great at poetry and bad at prose, referring to the way that he was great at campaigning but bad at governing. The key here is that both the they say and the I say positions agree about the baseline and the pivot. They agree that there is a question of what happened to the Democratic Party between 2008 and 2016. They agree that the future was once bright for Democrats, but now it looks bleak. Their difference is in how they answer the question of why that might be. So the author distinguishes his I say position by first introducing possible responses to that question, and then and then going on to explain how his I say is actually distinct from those answers. So another example of introducing the they say after the baseline can be found in this op-ed about Facebook and fake news by Jessica Lessin. The first sentence begins with the common ground position. We finally got a grudging mea culpa from Mark Zuckerberg, an admission that fake news is a significant problem that his social network must help solve. The emphasis on we shows that everyone agrees that this is a problem, that even the people that Lessin is going to argue with start with the same common ground or baseline that she does. Then the author quickly pivots and says that she finds, quote, the calls for Facebook to accept broad responsibility for fact-checking the news, including by hiring editors and reporters, deeply unsettling. So she is immediately contrasting her I say solution from the they say solution of those who think it is Facebook that is responsible to get rid of fake news on their website. She finds that solution to be unprecedented and dangerous. That's her I say position, her solution, as compared to the they say of what others want to argue, how they want to resolve this problem of Facebook and fake news. Okay, so to recap, you can introduce the they say position, that is the position you want to respond to and you want to argue with, in either the baseline or in the solution section of your introduction. Where you introduce the they say position will depend on whether you think the argument you are responding to is ignoring the question or problem you want to raise, in which case you would incorporate the they say into the baseline, or whether you are arguing about their solution to a common problem or question, in which case it makes more sense to introduce it after the baseline and the pivot.